In the grand scheme of galactic politics, the Zephyrian Empire had achieved something truly remarkable. They had convinced an entire galaxy that they were basically space gods, and honestly, who could blame everyone else for buying it? When your average Tuesday involves casually rearranging solar systems and your weekend hobby is uplifting primitive civilizations just to watch them build statues in your honor, you tend to develop a certain confidence. Commander Vex Thornquill stood on the bridge of the Imperial dreadnought Eternal Dominion, watching another species grovel at his feet through the viewscreen. The Blobonians of Sector 7 had just finished constructing a monument to Zephyrian greatness that could be seen from orbit. It was shaped like Vex's own magnificent cranial ridges, which he found both appropriate and insufficiently detailed. Commander squeaked his aide, Lieutenant Pip Questhorn, the Blobonians are requesting permission to name their star after you. Vex adjusted his ceremonial cape, the one woven from crystallized starlight and the tears of conquered worlds. Tell them they may name their star after my left boot. I am far too important for an entire star system. This was just another day in paradise for the Zephyrians. For 3,000 years, they had ruled the galaxy not through brute force, though they certainly had plenty of that, but through the simple understanding that they were obviously, undeniably, magnificently superior to everyone else. Their technology was so advanced it might as well have been magic. Their intellect was so vast it made quantum computers look like pocket calculators. Their culture was so refined that they had 17 different words for the specific type of disappointment one feels when observing lesser beings. Sir, Pip continued, consulting his holographic tablet, we also have reports from the tentacled ones of Proxima Beta. They've finished their pyramid of tribute, and are requesting guidance on proper prostration angles. 45 degrees, Vex replied without looking up from his own reflection in the polished floor. Any higher, and it lacks proper reverence. Any lower, and they might strain their pseudopods. The beautiful thing about being a galactic overlord, Vex had learned, was that once you established your divine status, the paperwork practically handled itself. Species lined up to surrender their resources, their labor, their firstborn children, all for the privilege of basking in Zephyrian glory. It was efficient, profitable, and deeply satisfying to Vex's sense of natural order. Commander, Pip said, his voice taking on that particular tone that suggested he was about to deliver news that might require actual attention. There's something else. Long-range sensors have detected an unknown vessel approaching from the outer rim. It appears to be damaged. Vex finally looked up from his admiration of his own magnificence. Unknown? In my galaxy. It's broadcasting some sort of signal, sir. Crude radio waves. The translation matrix is having difficulty with the language, but it appears to be asking for assistance. Vex's laugh could have shattered the ego of a lesser being. Assistance. Some primitive species dares to enter Zephyrian space and request help from their gods. He straightened his cape and checked his reflection one more time. Pip, prepare the subjugation protocols. It seems we have another civilization to properly educate about their place in the cosmic order. After all, Vex thought as he gazed out at the stars that belonged to him, when you're a god, every day brings new worshippers. It was just a matter of teaching them how to pray correctly. The ship that limped into Zephyrian space looked like it had been assembled by a committee of blind mechanics during an earthquake. The Lucky Strike was a Frankenstein's monster of welded hull patches, jury-rigged engines, and what appeared to be an honest-to-goodness satellite dish duct-taped to the communications array. If the Zephyrians had a word for catastrophically ugly, this ship would have redefined it. Captain Jake Briggs sat in his captain's chair, which was actually a reclining office chair he'd found at a space station yard sale, and squinted at the view screen. Well, would you look at that, Ruby? Fancy neighborhood. Engineer Ruby Kowalski looked up from the control panel she was currently percussive maintaining with a wrench. Yeah, real hoity-toity. Think they have a space Starbucks. Only one way to find out, Jake said, reaching for what passed for their communications system. This is Captain Jake Briggs of the cargo vessel Lucky Strike. We're having some engine trouble and could use a hand. Also, if anyone knows where we can get decent coffee, that'd be great. On the bridge of the Eternal Dominion, Vex stared at the transmission with the sort of expression usually reserved for discovering something unpleasant on the bottom of one's shoe. There, asking for coffee. It appears to be a primitive stimulant beverage, sir, Pip replied, consulting his cultural database. Made from ground seeds. Quite barbaric, really. And they want us to help them. Vex's voice carried the incredulous tone of someone being asked to do their own laundry. Do they not understand who we are? The Lucky Strike's transmission crackled back to life. Hello? Anyone out there? Look, I don't want to be a bother, but our navigation system is held together with prayer and electrical tape. And frankly, the prayer's not holding up its end of the bargain. Vex straightened his ceremonial sash. This was clearly a teaching moment. Open a channel, Pip. Full ceremonial protocols. The view screen shimmered to life, displaying Vex in all his magnificent glory, backlit by the gentle glow of 1,000 conquered suns. His voice boomed across space with the authority of 3 millennia of absolute rule. I am Commander Vex Thornquill, of the Zephyrian Empire, Master of Stars, Shepherd of Worlds, he whose name echoes across the cosmic void. You have entered the domain of gods, primitive ones. Prepare to. Oh hey there. Jake's cheerful voice cut through the dramatic proclamation like a chainsaw through silk. Nice hat by the way. Very shiny. Look, we're not looking for trouble, just trying to get to the Kepler station to deliver some agricultural equipment. You wouldn't happen to know if we're going the right way, would you? There was a moment of silence that stretched across the cosmos. Vex blinked once, twice, then looked at Pip as if the universe had just explained that gravity was optional. Did he just compliment my ceremonial crown? I believe he called it a hat, sir. A hat. Vex repeated the word like it was a foreign curse. A hat. Ruby's voice joined the conversation from somewhere off-screen. Jake, ask them if they've got any spare coolant. This bucket's running hotter than a politician's pants. Oh right, Jake said, turning back to face the screen. My engineer wants to know if you've got any spare coolant. She's got magic hands when it comes to keeping junk running, but even magic needs materials to work with. Vex felt something crack inside his brain. Not physically, mind you, but the sort of crack that happens when your entire worldview encounters something it simply cannot process. These beings had entered his domain, ignored his titles, complimented his sacred regalia, as if it were casual wear, and now they were asking him for spare parts. They don't know, he whispered to Pip. They actually don't know who we are. Perhaps they're playing some sort of primitive tactical game, sir. No, Vex said, watching Jake wave cheerfully at the camera while Ruby continued hammering something in the background. I don't think they're smart enough for tactics. Against every instinct screaming in his genetically superior brain, Vex found himself inviting the humans aboard the Eternal Dominion. Call it morbid curiosity, call it the need to understand this cosmic anomaly, or call it the simple fact that in 3,000 years of ruling the galaxy, nothing this entertainingly bizarre had ever happened to him. The airlock hissed open and Captain Jake Briggs stepped aboard the most advanced warship in galactic history wearing cargo pants, a t-shirt that read Galaxy's okayest captain and boots that had seen better decades. Ruby followed behind him, wiping her hands on a rag and looking around with the casual interest of someone touring a friend's apartment. Wow, Jake said, taking in the crystalline corridors that hummed with barely contained cosmic energy. This is nice. Very clean. Do you guys have a cleaning service or is this just good housekeeping? Vex, resplendent in his formal diplomatic robes that cost more than most planets' annual budgets, gestured grandly toward the Hall of Eternal Majesty. Behold, primitive ones, the seat of galactic power. These walls have witnessed the submission of 10,000 worlds. Cool architecture, Ruby said, running her finger along a control panel that regulated the life support for an entire solar system. Is this touch sensitive? Oh neat, it lights up. Please don't touch that, Pip squeaked. It controls the orbital mechanics of the Andromedas system. No kidding. That's pretty handy. We've got something similar on the Lucky Strike, but it only works if you hit it just right. Ruby gave the panel an experimental tap. See? Responsive design. Good engineering. Vex led them deeper into the ship, past artifacts that lesser civilizations had built temples to house. The crown of infinite sorrow, worn by the last emperor of the Vegan Confederacy before Zephyrian conquest. The singing crystal of Proxima, whose resonance frequency could shatter moons. Jake paused at the crystal. Oh hey, this looks like my grandmother's wind chime. Does it make noise too? That is the singing crystal of Proxima, Vex said through gritted teeth. Its song has driven lesser minds to madness. Really? Ruby, come check this out. Think it's the same frequency as that weird harmonic the engines make? Ruby ambled over and gave the crystal a professional once-over. Might be. Could probably tune it out with the right dampening field. She pulled out what appeared to be a sonic screwdriver held together with electrical tape. Mind if I take a quick measurement? You want to tune the singing crystal of Proxima? Well, not permanently. Just see what frequency it's running at. Bet I could get it to harmonize with something useful, maybe boost your communications array. Vex felt his left eye begin to twitch. They had just offered to improve a sacred artifact like it was a broken radio. The tour continued into the Strategic Command Center, where holographic displays showed the positions of every fleet in Zephyrian space. Jake whistled appreciatively. Now this is a nice setup. Very organized. We've got something similar, but it's mostly post-it notes and hope. This system coordinates the movements of over 50,000 warships, Vex said, attempting to regain some sense of awe and reverence. 50,000, wow. Jake studied the display with genuine interest. Must be a nightmare to keep supplied. What's your logistics network look like? And that's when something terrible happened. Vex, conditioned by 3 millennia of receiving worship and terror, found himself actually answering the question, like a peer talking to another peer. Like an equal discussing professional challenges with an equal. Well, the outer rim supply lines are actually quite complex, he heard himself saying. We maintain depot stations every 12 light years, but the fuel consumption calculations become exponentially more difficult when you factor in. He stopped mid-sentence, horrified. He was having a normal conversation, with primitives, about logistics. Ruby meanwhile had wandered over to a maintenance panel and was poking around inside it with her screwdriver. Jake, come look at this. They've got their power distribution all backwards. No wonder they need such massive reactors. Don't touch that, Pip shrieked. It's fine, I'm just optimizing the flow patterns. See, now you're running about 15% more efficiently. Ruby closed the panel with satisfaction. There you go. That should help with your energy costs. Vex stared at the readouts. She was right. The ship was running more efficiently. A human had just improved Zephyrian technology by treating it like a household appliance that needed a tune-up. How did you? He began. Oh, same principle as our ship's fusion plant, Ruby said cheerfully. Just bigger and shinier. Basic engineering is basic engineering, you know. Vex stood in his private chambers that night, staring at his reflection in a mirror forged from compressed neutron star material. His eye was still twitching. Somewhere in the guest quarters, he could hear the humans laughing about something, probably his entire civilization's most sacred traditions, and the sound made his ceremonial crown feel uncomfortably tight. Commander, Pip's voice came through the intercom. The humans have sent a request for breakfast. They're asking if we have anything that doesn't glow. Everything we eat glows, Pip. It's a sign of our advanced nutritional science. They said, and I quote, that's cool and all. But do you have anything that looks like it won't give us superpowers? We're trying to keep a low profile. Vex closed his eyes and counted to 10 in ancient Zephyrian, then in standard Galactic, then in the ceremonial tongue used only for cursing one's enemies across the void. None of it helped. By morning, he had made a decision that would echo through galactic history, though at the time it seemed like simple self-preservation. If these humans were going to treat him like an equal, then by the sacred flames of Zephyrius Prime, he would prove beyond any doubt that they were not. We're going to test them, he announced to Pip over breakfast that definitely did not glow, because the food synthesizers had been mysteriously reprogrammed overnight. Test them, sir. The trials of worthiness. If they want to be treated as more than primitives, they can prove they deserve it. Vex's smile was the sort that had previously been reserved for watching enemy fleets surrender, and when they fail spectacularly, the natural order will be restored. An hour later, Jake and Ruby found themselves in the ship's main arena, a space normally used for gladiatorial combat between captured warriors of conquered worlds. The walls were lined with energy barriers that could contain a supernova, and the floor was made from materials harder than crystallized time itself. So, Jake said, looking around with mild interest, this is like an escape room, right? The trials of worthiness, Vex announced from his elevated platform, have been failed by the greatest minds in galactic history. Beings with intellects that dwarf suns have wept before these challenges. Sounds fun, Ruby said, already examining the first puzzle mechanism. Jake, this looks like that combination lock we had on the supply closet back on Earth. You know, the one that never worked right. The first trial was the labyrinth of infinite recursion, a maze that existed in 17 dimensions simultaneously and had driven mathematics professors to madness just by looking at the blueprints. The solution required understanding of hyperdimensional geometry that took most species centuries to develop. Jake walked up to the entrance, studied it for exactly 3 seconds, then turned to Ruby. Left, right, straight, left, right. Probably, most of these things follow the same pattern. If it's too complicated, there's usually a simple way through. They walked through the maze in 4 minutes flat, chatting about whether the ship's cafeteria might have decent sandwiches. Vex stared. That's impossible. The labyrinth of infinite recursion has 17 different. Oh, we just followed the air current. Jake called back. Places like this always have ventilation systems, and they've got to connect to the exit somehow. Basic building codes, you know. The second trial was the Chamber of Ultimate Logic, where participants had to solve a philosophical paradox that had stumped the greatest thinkers in galactic history. The question involved the nature of existence, the paradox of infinite regression, and the fundamental problem of consciousness observing itself. Ruby read the question, blinked twice, then said, "The answer is 42. That's not." Vex sputtered. You can't just answer 42 to the fundamental question of existence. Why not? I mean, either there's an answer or there isn't, right? And if someone's asking the question, they probably want a number. 42's as good as any. The chamber's ancient mechanisms whirred for a moment, processed this logic, and grudgingly opened the exit door. For the third trial, Vex was getting desperate. The combat simulation of inevitable doom pitted challengers against an AI that had analyzed every battle strategy in galactic history. It was programmed with the tactical knowledge of 10,000 civilizations, and had never been defeated. Jake looked at the control interface, which resembled the cockpit of the most advanced fighter craft ever designed. Huh, looks like a video game. Ruby, you want to try co-op mode? Sure, but I call dibs on the big guns. What followed was 10 minutes of the most unorthodox combat tactics ever recorded. Jake flew their simulated fighter like someone who had learned to drive from action movies, while Ruby treated the weapons systems like particularly explosive musical instruments. They didn't follow any known strategic doctrine, because they didn't know any strategic doctrine existed. The AI, programmed to counter every known tactical approach, had no response to opponents who treated a life-or-death space battle like a particularly energetic game of pinball. Game over, the system announced. Victory, humans. Vex's mouth was hanging open in a way that was definitely not dignified for a galactic overlord. What did you? That AI has the combined strategic knowledge of, oh, we played a lot of space shooters back on Earth. Jake said, climbing out of the simulator. The trick is not to overthink it, just point, shoot, and try not to crash into anything important. Around the arena, Vex noticed something that made his blood run cold. Other species were watching. Delegates from the tentacled ones, representatives from the Blobonian collective, even a few of the crystal beings from the Magellanic clouds. All of them were taking notes, and they were all looking at the humans with something that definitely wasn't terror. The breaking point came during what was supposed to be a simple debriefing session. Vex had intended it as a face-saving exercise, a chance to explain to the gathered alien delegates why the humans' success was merely a fluke, an amusing anomaly in the natural order of Zephyrian supremacy. Instead, it became the diplomatic equivalent of watching a perfectly organized library burn down while someone played cheerful music in the background. So, Jake said, settling into a chair that had been carved from a single piece of crystallized dark matter. Those were some interesting puzzles. Who designed them? The trials were created by the greatest minds in Zephyrian history. Vex replied, trying to maintain some shred of dignity. Each challenge represents millennia of advanced theoretical development. Huh? Jake scratched his head thoughtfully. Well, the first one was pretty clever, but you might want to think about the ventilation situation. Having all that airflow going one direction makes it kind of obvious where the exit is. From the viewing gallery, Ambassador Glubnox of the Tentacled Ones leaned forward with interest. You're saying the maze wasn't actually solved through hyperdimensional mathematics? Oh no, nothing that fancy. Ruby chimed in. Basic HVAC principles. Air's got to go somewhere, right? Follow the flow, find the exit. We had the same problem with a warehouse back on Earth. Cost us a fortune in heating bills until we figured out where all the drafts were coming from. Vex felt something cold settle in his stomach. The labyrinth of infinite recursion it's not a heating, ventilation and air conditioning problem. Well, maybe not intentionally, Jake said with a shrug, but that's what made it solvable. Sometimes the simple answer is the right answer, you know. The Blobonian representative, Ambassador Squish, made what passed for an excited noise among his species. And the philosophical paradox. The chamber of ultimate logic. Oh, that. Ruby waved dismissively. Classic overthinking problem. When someone asks you the meaning of life, the universe, and everything, they're not really looking for a philosophical treatise. They just want you to pick a number and commit to it. 42 works as well as anything else. But the profound implications of existence itself, Vex protested weakly. The fundamental nature of consciousness and reality. Look, Jake said, leaning forward with the patient tone of someone explaining something obvious to a child. Either there's an answer to that question or there isn't. If there isn't, then any answer works. If there is, then you won't know if you're right until you guess. So why not 42? It's as good as any other number. The assembled delegates were frantically taking notes. Vex could practically see the gears turning in their alien minds, centuries of assumed Zephyrian intellectual superiority crumbling like a house of cards in a hurricane. The combat simulation, he said desperately. Surely you understand that was the most advanced tactical AI in galactic history. Sure, it was pretty sophisticated, Ruby acknowledged. But that was kind of the problem. wasn't it? It was so busy trying to predict what we were going to do that it couldn't adapt when we did something unpredictable. Like what? Like using the shield generators as weapons. Jake said. That was Ruby's idea. Brilliant. Really? Ruby grinned. The AI kept trying to counter our weapons, but it never occurred to it that we'd use our defensive systems offensively. Basic misdirection. You see it all the time in sports back home. Ambassador Crystalline of the Silicon Collective made a sound like breaking glass, which Vex had learned was their equivalent of laughter. So your strategy was to not have a strategy. Exactly, Jake said, pointing at the crystal being with enthusiasm. See, that's what I'm talking about. The moment you commit to a plan, you're locked into thinking about the problem one way. But if you stay flexible, adapt on the fly, you can respond to whatever comes up. This is madness, Vex muttered. But even as he said it, he could see the other delegates nodding in understanding. Is it though? Ambassador Glubnox asked, his tentacles writhing with what Vex was beginning to recognize as excitement. Commander Vex, how many times have your own tactical simulations been defeated? Never, Vex said automatically. The system is perfect, and yet these humans defeated it in 10 minutes. Squish observed. Perhaps the system's perfection was its weakness. Vex stared at the Blobonian ambassador. In 3,000 years of Zephyrian rule, no one had ever suggested that their perfection might be a flaw. The concept was so alien to him that he couldn't even process it properly. Commander, Pip whispered urgently in his ear, we're receiving communication requests from 17 different species. They're all asking about trade negotiations. Direct trade negotiations. With the humans. The humans, meanwhile, seemed oblivious to the galactic paradigm shift happening around them. Jake was showing Ambassador Crystalline pictures of Earth dogs on his phone, while Ruby was explaining the finer points of percussive maintenance to a fascinated group of engineers from various species. You see, Ruby was saying, the key is knowing exactly where to hit it. Too hard and you break something. Too soft and nothing happens. But just the right amount of force in just the right spot. She demonstrated on Pip's datapad, which had been acting up all morning. It immediately started working perfectly. Remarkable, breathed one of the engineers. And this technique works on most technological systems. Pretty much. Though you've got to be careful with quantum stuff. Hit that wrong and you might accidentally create a paradox or something. Vex watched his carefully constructed galaxy crumble around him. These humans weren't just ignoring his divine authority, they were accidentally teaching everyone else to ignore it too. And the worst part was, they were doing it by being helpful. Commander, Pip whispered, his voice shaking. I'm receiving reports from across the Empire. Other species are starting to question things. The Andromedans are asking why they need permission to modify their own planetary defense systems. The Cetacean Alliance wants to know why they can't establish direct diplomatic relations with other species. And, they're all referencing the humans' approach to problem solving. They're saying if basic engineering principles and common sense can solve Zephyrian trials, maybe Zephyrian rule isn't as inevitable as we claimed. Vex sank into his command chair, watching Jake teach a group of alien diplomats how to play rock paper scissors while Ruby casually fixed a communication device that had been mysteriously malfunctioning for decades. The humans weren't conquering his empire through force or cunning. They were conquering it through the radical act of treating everyone like equals, and assuming that most problems had simple solutions if you just approached them without preconceptions. It was, Vex realized with growing horror, the most devastatingly effective strategy anyone had ever used against him. And they probably didn't even realize they were doing it. 3 months later, Vex stood in what used to be called the Hall of Eternal Majesty but was now simply referred to as the meeting room by everyone except him. The change in terminology was small, but it represented something much larger. The complete and utter collapse of everything he had spent his life believing in. The emergency session of the Galactic Council was supposed to address the human problem, though Vex was beginning to suspect that he was the only one who still saw it as a problem. Around the great circular table, representatives from 47 different species sat in chairs instead of kneeling on the traditional submission platforms. Ambassador Glubnox had even brought coffee, which he'd apparently learned to make from Ruby's detailed instructions. The item before us today, announced Ambassador Crystalline, who had somehow become the unofficial moderator of these sessions, is the proposed establishment of the Galactic Cooperative Trade Alliance. A fancy name for cutting us out of the power structure. Vex muttered to Pip, who was taking notes on a tablet that Ruby had optimized and now worked 3 times faster than standard Zephyrian technology. Actually, said Ambassador Squish, his blobby form rippling with what Vex had learned was enthusiasm, we'd like the Zephyrians to join as equal partners. Your infrastructure is quite impressive, and according to human engineering principles, we could improve efficiency across all systems by approximately 37%. Equal partners. The words hit Vex like a meteor to the face. We are not equal partners. We are your rulers. We are gods among mortals. You're really good at building big impressive stuff, Jake interrupted cheerfully, walking into the meeting room with Ruby trailing behind him, both carrying what appeared to be fusion-powered coffee makers. But you've got some serious optimization issues. Ruby's been looking at your supply chain logistics, and wow, there's a lot of room for improvement. Ruby nodded, setting down her coffee maker and immediately beginning to fiddle with the room's environmental controls. The thing is, you guys design everything to be perfect, which sounds great in theory. But perfect systems are rigid systems. They can't adapt when conditions change. What you want is robust systems that can handle unexpected inputs. Like humans wandering into your galaxy and treating you like technical support, asked Ambassador Glubnox, his tentacles curling in what Vex now knew was amusement. Exactly, Jake said, accepting a cup of coffee from Ruby's jury-rigged machine. Though to be fair, we weren't trying to cause a revolution or anything. We just needed directions and maybe some spare parts. Vex felt his left eye resume its familiar twitch. You caused the collapse of a 3,000-year-old galactic empire because you needed directions. Well, when you put it like that, it sounds kind of silly, Jake admitted. But think about it from our perspective. We show up and this guy with the fancy hat starts talking about how he's a god and we should worship him. But then he starts answering basic questions about supply chain management like a normal person. Mixed messages, you know. I was being condescending, Vex protested weakly. Were you? Because it seemed like you actually knew what you were talking about. The logistics stuff, I mean. You've got a really good grasp on the practical challenges of managing a galactic empire. And there it was again. Jake was treating him like a competent professional who had useful knowledge, rather than a divine being whose word was law. It should have been insulting. Instead, Vex found himself oddly pleased by the recognition of his actual skills. The supply lines are quite complex, he heard himself saying. Maintaining depot stations across 17 different stellar clusters requires careful coordination of resource allocation and, he stopped mid-sentence, horrified. He was doing it again. Having a normal conversation about work challenges with someone who treated him like an equal. See, that's what I'm talking about, Ruby said, looking up from where she was apparently rewiring the conference table's holographic display system. You guys know your stuff. You just got caught up in all the God Emperor drama and forgot that competence is more impressive than ceremony. The God Emperor drama is our entire civilization, Vex said, but even as he said it, the words felt hollow. Is it though? Ambassador Crystalline asked, her silicon form refracting the room's light in thoughtful patterns. Or is it just the packaging? Because from what we've observed over the past few months, your actual civilization is quite remarkable. Your engineering is solid, your organizational skills are exceptional, and your cultural achievements are genuinely impressive. The whole divine ruler thing was just marketing. Vex stared at her. Marketing. Well, yeah, Jake said, settling into what had once been the throne of absolute authority and was now just a very comfortable chair. You built this amazing galactic civilization and you needed a way to keep it all working together. So you created this image of yourselves as gods. It's actually pretty clever, from a management perspective. But the marketing got in the way of the actual work, Ruby added, making some final adjustments to the holographic display. There, that's better. Now your communications array is tied into the main sensor network. Should reduce message lag by about 40%. Around the table, Vex could see the other ambassadors nodding in understanding. They were looking at him not with fear or worship, but with the kind of respect people gave to someone who was genuinely good at their job. So, Ambassador Glubnox said, shall we discuss the cooperative trade agreement? I believe the humans have prepared a preliminary framework. It's pretty straightforward, Jake said, pulling out a tablet that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts and optimism. Everyone contributes what they're good at. Everyone gets access to what they need, and we all try to help each other solve problems, instead of just following orders from the top down. Revolutionary, Vex said, sarcastically. Not really, Ruby replied, completely missing the sarcasm. It's just basic project management. You've got a bunch of different teams with different specialties working toward common goals. The key is communication and flexibility. Vex looked around the room at representatives from species that had worshipped his people for millennia, now discussing trade routes and resource allocation like colleagues working on a group project. The Eternal Dominion, his mighty flagship, was being used to host what amounted to a very polite business meeting. Commander, Pip whispered. The latest reports show productivity across the Empire is up 18% since we started implementing human organizational principles. Civil unrest is down to nearly zero, and we're receiving unprecedented cooperation from member species. Because they're not members anymore, Vex said quietly. They're partners. Yes, sir. And according to the preliminary analysis, this approach is far more efficient than the previous divine mandate system. Vex watched Jake enthusiastically, explaining the concept of distributed decision-making to a group of fascinated alien diplomats, while Ruby casually improved another piece of perfect Zephyrian technology. These humans had walked into his galaxy, treated him like a person instead of a god, and accidentally created the most stable and productive political system in galactic history. And the most infuriating part was that it was working better than anything he'd ever accomplished through 3,000 years of absolute rule. Fine, he said, standing up from his throne chair and walking over to the conference table. Let's discuss this cooperative trade agreement. But I want it on record that I'm not doing this because you're right. I'm doing it because it's the practical thing to do. Jake suggested helpfully. Vex sighed, a sound that contained the weight of 3 millennia of divine authority crumbling into dust. Yes, because it's the practical thing to do. As he sat down at the table, no longer a god among mortals but simply a very competent administrator with good ideas about supply chain management, Vex had to admit something to himself. For the first time in his very long life, he was actually looking forward to going to work. After all, it turned out that being respected for your actual skills was a lot more satisfying than being worshipped for your fancy hat. Even if it had taken a couple of humans with a broken spaceship to teach him that lesson. The galaxy, it seemed, was finally ready to grow up. And sometimes, that was the most revolutionary thing of all.